I'm Dakota Palicki, and this is the Lumina podcast, our chance to visit with newsmakers and thought leaders in the field of learning and training after high school. Lumina supports making opportunities for learning beyond high school available to everybody. We want to prepare people for citizenship and success in a global economy. We support an equitable system that is fair, easy to navigate, and meets the nation's need for talent. The Lumina podcast features the people creating this vision and the change we hope to see. We'll focus on what's going well, what needs to change, and how the country can have the talent that we need. Today, we're talking with Dr. Andre Perry, a fellow at the Brookings Institution, about his work on race and structural inequality, education, and economic inclusion. Dr. Perry has worked extensively in education. He's led a charter school network in New Orleans, served as Associate Director of Loyola University's Institute for Quality and Equity in Education, and has been the founding Dean of Urban Education at Davenport University. While at Brookings, he's focused his scholarship on majority Black places and institutions, highlighting valuable assets worthy of increased investment. Dr. Perry, thanks so much for being with us today.
Hey, Dakota. How are you?
Doing well. Yourself?
Doing well.
Great. Well, thanks again for coming in. And we know you've been working on a series of studies for about a year now that examine how majority Black cities are doing. What have you been finding?
Yeah, first and foremost, we're finding that there's a lot of them. There are 1,200 majority Black places, meaning there are census-designated places that are more than 50% or more than 50% of the population is Black. And we're also finding that there are strengths in these places, economic strengths, social strengths, and political strengths. But many of those places don't receive the kind of investments commensurate with those assets. So my job at the Brookings Institution is to map those assets, to figure out where they are so that we can direct future investment.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, what are some of the assets that you're finding in majority Black communities? And I know a lot of your research has been talking about the way structurally many of those assets have been devalued. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah, one of the first studies that's coming out in a paper in October is one that we look at housing prices. Now we're seeing that just because of a home is in a majority Black place, its price can be 25 to 50% less than the equivalent home in a white space. Now, that translates to billions of dollars being lost in majority Black places. And so, but that's just one aspect of Black life that we're looking at the devaluation of. We need to figure out and pay attention to all of those ways Black strength and assets are devalued so that we can then leverage those strengths for future economic growth. One of my favorite plays in all the world is Two Trains Running by the great playwright August Wilson. And in the play, the main character, Memphis, is about to have his business purchased by the city of Pittsburgh through eminent domain. The main character throughout the play argues, "No, I'm not. You're not going to purchase my business for $15,000. I know my price." He wanted more, and throughout the play, there's a common refrain: "I know my price." One of the other characters, Hambone, did some work for a business owner and for a ham that he did not receive. And throughout the play, he demands his ham, but he goes crazy, insane, demanding for his ham. Throughout the play, Memphis says, "I know my price, I know my price." At the end of the play, he gets $30,000. The point of that play is, and the moral of the story is, know that people have value. Know that people have to know their worth. My products, my analytics that I'm giving to communities is not for the folks who refuse to recognize the strength of Black communities. It is to show to members of those Black communities that they have a price. They should demand their price, and they can actually change the trajectory of the communities by laying claim to their price.
I love that, knowing your value. I think that's really important. And of course, at Lumina, we focus a lot on talent and about education. And we know we were just discussing how sometimes our institutions right now, whether it's traditional higher education or workforce preparation programs, whatever it is, often are not set up in a way that recognize the talent, that recognize someone's individual value. Are you finding that is more true in communities of color? What are your findings related to the evaluation of talent?
I as you mentioned, I ran 4 charter schools out of the University of New Orleans in a post-Katrina environment. And I saw firsthand how the achievement gap and that achievement gap language was used as a tool to keep resources away from Black and brown teachers. Needless to say that during a storm or after a storm, where people are scrambling to get back to some sense of normalcy, to get their homes back together, they need a place to work, to anchor themselves. And after the storm, we saw that the employees of New Orleans School District were summarily fired. Many found it hard to find jobs in the new charter environment. It had a significant net loss of Black teachers over time. We should have been building up capacity of Black employees during that environment. Instead, in the name of the achievement gap, we let people go. There are no reforms that, at the end of the day, when there are fewer Black teachers or students are being punished, expelled at extraordinarily high rates, if they're not getting their special needs services delivered, I don't care what achievement gap is being closed. You're not delivering justice to Black communities. You're not providing the type of resources that sustains communities. So we've got to know that structurally, when our reforms or when our efforts are truly not building capacity of communities of color. So my job is to make sure that we invest in strength. Certainly not all things in Black communities are in the position of strength, but we do know there are people, there are firms, there's talent that are worthy of investment, and we have to find them.
And what I like about your research, from what I've been able to read on it, is, as you just talked about, we can call attention to challenges and how structural inequity has perpetuated and continues to perpetuate disproportionate outcomes for folks. But you also go to great lengths, of course, and it's not that hard to identify the many assets that are within predominantly Black communities. And I was hoping you can touch a little bit on that as well.
In a nutshell, I also say that no one's going to invest in the deficit. Every time we put up these disparities, these racial disparities, and show how bad Black folk are doing, the resources that are needed for development never reach the Black communities. And in fact, what is invested in are people to fix Black folk. And that's going to enrich those organizations, not necessarily the people who need it. So, there's obviously strength in every community. Those that develop are a direct result of investment. Nothing grows without investment. And so if you're seeing businesses grow in particular parts of town, in particular industries, it's a result of direct investment in people. We talk as if the market is just some, or the economy is just some kind of storm cloud that finds its way and it just, or a force of nature that just happens. No, the economy changes because of individual decisions. Where do we want to put our money? And we simply do not trust Black and brown folk with that money. If we want development, we've got to be strategic. And again, I'm not saying that let's find ways to invest in any Black and brown person, but if there's strength in one community, there's strength in another. There are entrepreneurs, there are schools, there are universities, there are nonprofits, there are for-profit businesses that can do this work. They just need investment because they've been devalued. They are not recognized as of strength, and that's part of the insidious nature of racism, is that we've become accustomed to ignore the strengths in Black communities.
Today we're with Dr. Andre Perry from the Brookings Institution, talking about race and equity. Our conversation continues in a moment. Welcome back to the Lumina podcast. We're here today with Dr. Andre Perry, a fellow at the Brookings Institution, talking about cultivating talent in majority Black cities. So, Dr. Perry, if you don't mind, I'd like to learn a little bit more about you and your own personal work, and really, what got you to this work.
I always start from the beginning, how I was raised. As it's told to me by family members, I was taken from my mother and given to an older woman. She was 63 years old in the hood in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, a small municipality inside of Pittsburgh. And it was told to me that my mother had troubles, and it required me to live with this older woman. My older brother of 2 years came along with me. Later on, my younger brother came to join us. Along the way, there were about 12 other kids that this older woman and her daughter, Mom and Mary, they raised us from essentially birth. Some of the kids stayed for a few weeks, others stayed a few years. Intermittently, I stayed until I graduated from high school. My father was murdered in a jail outside of Detroit in Jackson Prison. And I say that to say I entered this space with a commitment to making family to people who aren't my relative, who aren't related to me by blood. But I'm committed to people in a much deeper way than blood would allow. I want and need for people of all walks of life to have the same opportunities to achieve the American dream or whatever conceptualization of growth one wants. And right now, that's not happening. It's not happening because there's unevenness in the distribution of resources for schools. There's unevenness in our students' ability to pay for higher education. Many of our colleges and universities are not delivering what's needed in communities. And so my commitment for my brothers and sisters leads me to this work to do educational equity. And it goes beyond education. Kids and adults don't live in schools and universities. They live in communities. One of the reasons why I'm working in cities is because if schools are going to work, transportation has to work. We have to have adequate infrastructure. There needs to be businesses flowing. There needs to be adequate housing. There needs to be safe streets. That this idea that if we can only fix the school, everything else will happen. No, we need to recognize schools and universities as part of a community that needs healing. And by the way, we treat majority Black cities like we treat Black people. We treat Black institutions like we treat Black people. And so if we're ever going to get to equity, we also need to address the stark inequalities and racism that's happening to these institutions. The same way we need to hold a cell phone camera to police brutality, we need to hold these institutions of higher learning and government agencies accountable, and have people see that there's nothing wrong with them. I travel around the country, and I have this common refrain, is I say there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. That we're constantly hearing what's wrong with Black and brown people, what they need to do. No, we need to remove these sources of inequality so that people can thrive.
So, working in a policy kind of environment, I hear you talking about making family. And also, another part of what you said is talking that, we treat black cities and black institutions like black people. And while those two things aren't at odds to each other, how do you make a family, a non-blood family that is, inclusive of the many folks that probably have mission aligned with you, who might also say, well, what do you mean by, we treat black cities like black people?
Well, first of all, policy, on the policy side, is supposed to help all folks. But unfortunately, many of the policies and the policy makers behind them are rife with biases. So in America, we're in a constant revision or a constant state of revising policies that are the vestiges of discrimination and segregation. We need to scrub the sexism, the racism, the homophobia away from the policies that advantage some and burden others. But we also need to be clear that this is not going to come from one organization's work, one foundation's work, or a think tank. It's going to come from folks finding partnerships, going into communities, practicing what we ask others to do, working together across lines of race, class, gender, to say, hey, we can help each other, empower communities. Again, I'm of this ilk. I want people to know their price. And foundations like Lumina, think tanks like Brookings, we need to give people a sense of their worth, not give them answers, but give them a sense of worth and value. And when we do that, we're going to see those communities demand and get the change they want to see.
Yeah, we were talking also about narratives, and clearly what you're touching on has a lot to do with commonly held narratives, either by policymakers or just by folks out in the public. And one of the narratives that we hear and often a lot is saying, what, we don't need to focus on race. Maybe focus on other areas of otherness, or, one of the other narratives I think a lot of folks out there combat is, well, race isn't an issue, especially, look at Obama, right? We've checked that box there, and I know this has been talked about to a great extent, but, what do you say to those who say, look, here are people of color who are doing well, who are reaching heights, who are achieving, high degrees of success. We don't need to focus on race anymore. Let's focus on these other areas of otherness, or let's focus on, as you said earlier, raising all boats.
Again, this is where evidence comes into play. 1 in 7 black men in New Orleans is in prison or on parole. 1 in 7 black men. You just don't see that in community. If there was in Indianapolis or Cincinnati or Pittsburgh, 1 in 7 white men in prison on parole, it would be some kind of epidemic. There would be folks running up and down the street demanding change. Many of the stats we see on the daily would never happen if whites were in that position. And so, and another way to look at this is, it's not about individuals and it's about systems. I have a lot to say about Trump. But Trump didn't invent racism. You can replace Trump. Racism's going to still exist. We need to look at systems. So often we blame people. It's so reflective to essentially tell black men and boys, sometimes literally to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, pull your pants up. That is not that's not the reason why whites go to college, because they have belt wearing strategies that are different. Their higher home ownership rates are because they have better haircuts. And they're no, it comes from policy. And if we want to see the kind of equity, it's going to come from the policies that actually cause inequality. So we do need new housing policy. We do need better education policy. We do need safer streets. And so this idea that racism went away because Obama was elected is ridiculous. And it's a distraction, quite frankly, from correcting the wrongs of the past and moving forward with a new agenda, a new vision of what we can be.
Great. Today we're with Andre Perry from Brookings, and next up we're going to talk about what that new agenda can be and where we go from here. Welcome back to the Lumina podcast. I'm Dakota Palicki. Today we're here with Andre Perry from the Brookings Institution talking about race and equity. So as we think about solutions and where we're heading, where are places that are getting this right? Where are places that are doing well? What more can we be learning from the field of and really, as you've been talking about, invest in the places that have assets and that are strengths?
I have to say, I've been to a lot of places, Pittsburgh, Birmingham, Detroit recently, that I see housing advocates, developers, entrepreneurs, engineers that have capacity. They just don't have investment. I can take you to Innovation Depot and look at the Black entrepreneurs there and in Birmingham and show you where their strength. I can point to Rodney Sampson and his O-Hub doing work all across the country, doing work there. There's the Entrepreneurial Center at Morehouse. Howard University is doing great work with Google. There are opportunities. But I think the larger issue is, can we identify those strengths? Will we allow ourselves to have new metrics and step away from this sort of deficit frame of always casting Black and brown folk in comparison to white folks who have gained their strength through privilege, through policy, not necessarily by I pulled myself up. We have got to eventually acknowledge that there are assets in Black communities, but there are also people who've gained advantages from policy. And so when you do that, then it becomes easier to say, hey, this isn't rocket science. You find strong people and you invest in them. We just are not committed to looking for strength in Black and brown communities, and we have not been committed to investing and trusting Black and brown folks with a serious coin. And that is what's going to take us over the hump: direct, deliberate investment in people we have not trusted thus far.
And so for those who are looking to make that direct investment, what are some of the alternative measures and metrics that we can use to more adequately or accurately measure talent?
Every day I come up with a new way to look at strength. So a few weeks ago, I looked at the cities with the highest proportions of STEM graduates across the country, and I challenged businesses. Hey, you're looking for STEM graduates? Why not go to these cities? They're there where the percentage of or the proportion of college graduates are high in STEM. Same in the business industry. We can figure out ways to create new measures. We just don't do that because we're constantly comparing Blacks to whites, and that's an apples to orange comparison, not because of talent, but it's really because of a large part of it is because of the wealth folks have been able to enjoy that Blacks could not enjoy. the housing policies, the redlining that created the enormous wealth gaps and prevented blacks from having wealth and their ability to endure shocks of unemployment and or have the capital to start a business. That just didn't happen because of a lack of hard work. It happened because of policy. And so we don't need to compare black entrepreneurs to white ones, particularly given those different starting points. And so we do need, though, to find out where strength is by simply looking for those areas that employers, investors, and others can then take advantage of. So that's been the bulk of my work. I encourage everybody to go to brookings.edu, check out my site, and look at the unique ways I'm mapping assets in different cities.
And coming to talent, right? Because again, that's what Lumina is all about. We see, especially coming out of K-12 reform, a number of at least in pockets, places that are interested and starting to use multiple measures kinds of assessments. I don't know if we see the same thing when we talk about adult talent.
Right.
When we talk about adult talent that's currently in the workforce, ready to either progress through, or the millions of adults who have yet to earn any kind of post-secondary training, industry certification, or let alone a degree. And I guess I kind of want to close on some of your thoughts about how can we get better at assessing the real talent that so many adults, and especially adults of color, have in our communities and cities around the nation, to get them into the system to participate in the economy and to continue to invest in their own neighborhoods and double down on the exact kind of thing that you're asking us to do. The
latest jargon that we use around talent development, particularly for adults, is work-based learning. And we are figuring out ways to examine talent in the workforce or in practice, as opposed to an academic sort of format. However, we simply need to get back to these basics that, one, employers should not say, if we can only get schools right, then we'll be better off. No, employers are a part of the education trajectory of people. Two, we do need new ways to measure a person's ability to do a job. Hey, I worked in education. Where teachers actually learn is in the practicum. I mean, it's the bulk of their learning is in the practicum. Teaching is a practice, as is many, if not most, fields. We need to look at ways to capture people's skills and abilities in practice in real time. We're sitting here in a studio. You can't tell me the engineers behind the boards learn by reading a book. They learn from sitting and watching someone and learning from them and doing it. Yet our degree programs don't reflect that reality. And we can do this in every field. I mean, unless you want to be an esoteric professor like I was, I mean, that makes no sense and completely unrelatable. But if you want to actually function in the world, you got to learn it from someone else. You need an opportunity to do. And so the more we can get back to this relational aspect of learning, that it takes internships, apprenticeships, it takes measuring capacities, and I'm an academic. I want people to learn through books, but I also want our institutions of higher learning to recognize talent as it's practiced in the field, because that's the way it works. Most of what I've learned in life came from somebody outside of school, outside of college. Someone showed me how to do something. They cared enough about me to do something. So we need to go back to that. Degrees are important. Relationships are more important. And if we're going to get back to that family aspect that I talked about earlier, we're really going to have to give ourselves a better shot of learning and growing together.
Dr. Perry, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the conversation.
Hey, anytime.
That's Dr. Andre Perry, a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. I'm Dakota Palicki, and this has been the Lumina Podcast. If you have a comment or an idea for a future show, reach us at luminafoundation.org or tweet me at Dakota Palicki. Thanks for joining us.